From our perception, we have noticed that businesses in Europe are aligning their efforts to achieve their net zero ambitions. We run a survey around 1,200 businesses here in Europe, and already 2/3 of them mentioned that they have a clear strategy on sustainability. However, they also said that half of them said that they are facing pressure from their customers to make their supply chain even more sustainable. And that's of course transforming into regulations. We see a number of regulations that either went on this year, and we also see the European trading system, for example, coming in early next year. And therefore we believe it's important for the supply chain leaders to understand what is the impact of these regulations into their supply chain and to look for different options that can help them to navigate and of course be compliant, but with the spirit of achieving their net zero ambitions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so these regulations are pretty, let's say, far-reaching. It's not just about the emissions of the individual company, what we call the Scope 1 emissions, perhaps Scope 2, referring to electric and consumptions of heat and those kind of things, but also Scope 3, actually involving, for instance, the supplier base of companies. So actually to be compliant, you need to fully understand what is happening in your supply chain, at least some tiers upstream your supply chain. And that will require new capabilities of those companies. At the same time, those regulations are indeed far-reaching, but there's also some uncertainty still there as well. How stringent are those regulations going to be? How is the enforcement going to be put in place? So I do see a point that several stakeholders are, let's say, stressing the importance of sustainability and require companies to be compliant. But what that actually means and will require them to do is in the actual enforcement and implementation of these measures is still also creating uncertainties, I think. For example, take the use of renewable energy. There we see an interesting interaction between seeing technological possibilities, but technological advance by itself is already an uncertainty. The extent to which the governments are actually investing and readying, let's say, the infrastructures that are required to provide those renewable energies, next to the operational complexities that come along with actually providing several renewable energy sources to the industry.
Mm-hmm. And I think you're highlighting a very important point. That is that in order to achieve their net zero ambitions and even to fulfill the regulations, they need to collaborate with their ecosystem. Otherwise, exactly. It seems like it won't be possible, at least in the to make a step change on the current profile.
Exactly, and because the industry actually needs to go through a transition towards net zero, as you already mentioned, and that requires investments in fleet, that requires a mind shift with owners. Of course, there are differences whether you talk about the global maritime industry or about, for example, the inland waterway industry in the European hinterland. There we do see a lot of small companies actually that also need to tag along with this transition. And that's also where we see in the Scope 3 emissions question also a risk that larger companies will indeed need to, at a pretty short term, need to actually be compliant and report their emissions. But if that is Scope 3, that means they will need to involve smaller companies that may not be ready to come up with reliable emission reports.